Okay, with that, I would like to turn it over to our senior research consultant at the ACEC Research Institute, Joe Bates. Joe?
Thank you very much, Carrie. Thank you all for joining us today. Very happy to see you with us again, Thomas. You were out over the last two quarters at various times because you are now a new father. So, congratulations on your newborn. And yeah, great to see you
Yeah,
back.
thank you very much. Thank you, ACEC, for letting me spend some time with my newborn son. And a big thanks to my colleague, Diana Olaire, who was covering for me while I was out. I really appreciate that, but very happy to be back and dive into the state of the engineering economy.
All right, well, we got a lot to cover today, as usual. So let's get started. We'll start with the US economy and talk about how it's doing. So we just got revised data in yesterday for the second quarter 2026 GDP, and this is the second estimate. It held steady at a growth rate of 1.5%, so that was pretty good news. The but it is showing us that we're slowing a little bit from Q1, which was pretty strong. But I was pleased to see that Q2 revision or update held pretty constant. There were some things underneath that I know you're going to talk about a little bit, Thomas, but overall that number stayed pretty steady. Here we have job growth, and in the latest number in July, we actually have a decline again. So last year, we saw very mixed results, and over the course of the year, the average monthly increase in jobs was less than 10,000. We started out pretty strong this year, but then we had some revisions, and you can see since March, we just had a steady decline in terms of job creation. But what's interesting is that the unemployment rate has continued to go down. And so let's talk a little bit about why. The labor force participation rate is one reason since November. While you are out, Thomas, the participation rate in the labor force has just plummeted, and this is really why we're not seeing an increase in the unemployment rate. So, what's going on here, Thomas? Can you help us understand the the macro picture looks good
Right.
in terms of the GDP, job growth, or unemployment is falling, but yet this doesn't look good here, right?
Right. I mean, and I think when we get into some of the sentiment data from the Research Institute, as well as what is happening in some other industries, there are still companies trying to fill positions, but there are not workers to fill those positions for a variety of reasons. With this sort of data, it's essentially people are leaving the labor force. I think, some bigger macro trends we talked about is just more folks retiring and leaving the labor force altogether, as well as I think decline in population over the past 15 or 18 months due to different immigration policies and basically impacting the overall right population growth rate, which has kind of come to a halt due to the net migration data. And I think there's also then just ongoing trends that have existed maybe even before COVID with respect to, folks leaving the labor force for a variety of reasons. So, I mean, it is pretty pronounced how much it has gone down over the past, you know, 10 to 12 months.
Yeah, and I did some calculations. If we had seen a consistent participation rate that we saw prior to the pandemic, accounting for the increase in people who are retiring, we still would have roughly 2 million to 2.5 to 3 million more people in the labor force, and that would actually translate to an unemployment rate that's closer to 5.5%. So Lots of things happening here. And overall, though, again, GDP held up at 1.5%. And we can see here that consumer spending continues to hold up. These are, not negative, so that's good. And these are monthly changes. So over the course of the year, you're going to add all of these numbers up. And the latest July number was again at a plus 0.2%. June was revised downward, just 0.1%, but still very, very healthy numbers here. And so that's good news. But then we kind of have the flip side of it, which is people are digging into their savings. They're not saving as much as they had been saving, and this has been going down for more than the last 2 years. But I just chose the last 2 years, Thomas, because as you know, people got a lot of savings during the pandemic with a lot of stimulus that happened. So again, it's like this good news, bad news picture. Thomas, one of the questions I think for you is: are we still seeing this K-shaped economy, or are the bottom 80% of consumers who aren't able to spend more and more and more, and are they catching up now? What's happening there?
I mean, I think it's a little of the lower decile groups are still seeing decent wage increases, but we are also seeing over the past 18 months, when you look at the Federal Reserve's household kind of credit reports, pretty big increase in credit card debt. So when you look at the different type of debts households have, auto loans, mortgage, credit card, student loans, credit card is definitely kind of growing the most, which would be the most concerning a data point to track, followed by student loans, and that is a function of what happened with the student loan forgiveness program basically coming to an end. I think about 18 months, 12 months ago. So the lower income households are, after a little bit in the spring, maybe cutting back on spending, start spending again. And so those numbers that we're seeing are for, evenly all households are spending, but, the challenge or potential problem is, are they borrowing from the future to spend today? How much are they borrowing? Is that going to be a problem while people are employed? That shouldn't be an issue. Obviously, if things like the unemployment rate start to tick up, then that will, be more cause for concern.
Yeah, yeah. And also, I know we talked in preparation for our presentation today, we talked about that GDP number, and AI is really fueling a lot right now. And certainly, if you have money in your 401k or invested, you're seeing benefits of that. And some of the sort of back of the envelope math tells us that it's roughly half of a percentage point of GDP. Like there's a lot of money coming from AI right now. So that's also, I think, helping to prop up that overall economy.
Yeah.
Well, the other side of the ledger here, we got to look at inflation. So people are spending more, but things are also costing more, right? And the CPI, the consumer price index, did start to notch down just a little bit here in the last month or two, but we're still well above that 2% range that the Federal Reserve is trying to target. So we're well above that. And even the core inflation, trying to find that in my notes. Oh, no, I can't find it. But you happen to remember what the core number is, Thomas?
For the CPI?
Yeah, for the CPI.
I think it's 2.5.
2.5. So still above, right? Okay. So, and then we look at another measure of inflation, and this is what the Federal Reserve looks at. The CPI is a basket of goods that doesn't change over time, or it's very slowly if they make updates. And so it's not necessarily the best and holistic picture. The PCE is a broader measure of what consumers are actually spending and buying, and the price inflation of those things that are actually being bought. And this curve is definitely going in the wrong direction. We see what we look at there is the gray line that is going up. It's gone up to 5.3% in Q2. That was revised upward yesterday from 5.1, so it's even higher than what the initial estimate showed. And the even looking excluding food and energy, while went down a little bit, it's still pretty high. We're at 3.6% in Q2, so still well above that 2% price target. So over to you, Thomas. I know you got more on this issue.
Right. So, this is kind of when we break down the PCE and think about the economy and what we're spending money on and how different components react to different monetary functions. You basically breaking it down between services and goods. We can see that, kind of what had been concerning from, let's say, 2022 to 2025 was that PCE was continuing to go up. We could see the gray line, which represents the cost of goods, which are physical items, things that are manufactured or created, reacts to higher interest rates, higher costs of capital. And, that line basically kind of hit a ceiling in the spring of 2022, which was the goal of what the Federal Reserve wanted when they raised interest rates to control costs. And it kind of just flatlined. However, at the start of this year, it has started to take off again. So thus is, we're talking PCE being now much, much higher than a 2% target, from 2022 to 2025. It was getting around, maybe the lowest it was getting was around 2.3, 2.4, which is, still not 2%, but at least we're getting in the ballpark of getting some of these post-COVID price increases under control. What is, much more concerning is this increase that basically, has started end of last year into this year, accelerating, right, the rate of increase. And I think we kind of dive into what that means for our industry on the next slide.
Okay.
Right. So, we deal with services, what our firms sell, which is our basically, design services, and then what we are designing for, which are the infrastructure we're building. So that black line representing the producer price index for non-residential construction, is behaving pretty similarly to how goods and other, cost of capital sensitive items were behaving, kind of flattening, even seeing a little bit of deflation in early 2023. However, since the start of 2026, it started to increase, and with the most recent data that came out early this week or last week, but for the month of July, we had about a 5.7% year-over-year increase in non-residential costs, which is the biggest increase since June of 2023. And, this is kind of a function now we're hitting. There are a few things that are driving that. One, most pronounced was the conflict in Iran, which then created oil price spikes as well as supply chain spikes, which, we analyzed back in May and saw that, those effects, when there's a shock to one of those on non-residential construction costs, can take, 8 to 9 months to really work their way through the whole system. And, seeing that in July from events that were happening in March makes sense. But also, we will get into this, but we are, depending on how you want to count or time when certain tariff measures went into effect, that has started to, continue to permeate through the business world. And, one of the most recent surveys from companies that came out in July talking about tariff costs, about 44% said they still plan to pass through tariff costs to, customers through price changes over the next 12 months. And, when we talked about tariffs 15, 18 months ago, the thing we were saying is they take, 8, 10, 12 months to kind of work their way through the whole economy. And so there's kind of a few things coming to a head and seeing, basically the biggest increase in three years. That is definitely, one of the most concerning things, I think. Costs for our industry that, is my takeaway from getting this presentation together.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting that, we're starting to see those effects. And we're going to come back to that in the sentiment because there's a bit of a disconnect there. Real quick for you, we got a couple questions here as we're going to our next slide. One of the questions is what is driving the increase in the PCE services prices, and how does that relate to the AE industry?
Well, I think the PCE is for households, and what are big cost drivers for what are considered services for households are cost of housing, as well as insurance and utilities, things like that. And so, I think what happens then, the second order effects are if your employee, you're paying your employee a wage and they plan their household budget based on this wage, whatever it is. But then over that 12-month period, their costs start going up. So, their paycheck is fixed month to month, and then they figure, I have this much to spend on electricity and gas and insurance. As that goes up, you kind of need to adjust your wages, right? If you want to keep your employee, or assuming you want to keep the employees, you want to adjust the wages. Otherwise, they will look for, jobs that pay more due to the cost of living. So, with respect to the PCE, it is kind of housing, utilities, and then insurance. And then, anyone who is at our spring conference knows healthcare costs are a huge challenge, and that has risen significantly, as well as just say like, the property, mortgage insurance, all those other insurance pieces as well.
Yeah, so I think the short answer, and that was a great answer, is that it trickles through, right? There's areas where it's affecting us in this part of the economy, but it also just trickles through the entire economy, affecting everybody. But here we have wholesale prices, which start to get a little closer to our industry, and we'll talk more specifically about our industry in the next section as well. All right. Sorry, Thomas. Did you want to talk about this?
Yeah. I mean, so this is just to then continue from the previous slide, the let's say, bright or silver lining of this cost increases at the gold line, which is for our member firm services cost. That has been trending down since kind of peaking post-COVID. And you can kind of see that gold line. There was a period from about 2023 up until last spring where our member firms' costs were increasing higher than the construction costs, but we see that inflection point basically at the end of last year, where we're now continuing to get services costs trending down while we're seeing that disconnect in the cost of, basically construction.
Yeah. There's another question. Is this the consumer spending based on dollars, or is that a percent of take-home income? That's dollars. That is not a percent of take-home income. So I just wanted to answer that question quickly. So not surprisingly, the first bit of sentiment data that we have to look at is on inflation. And we're seeing that the folks in the ACEC membership, the firm leaders that we survey every quarter, and there's about 600 of them who respond, they are saying, yes, I am much more concerned about inflation impacting my firm in the coming year. That has jumped up as of second quarter, and it's up at a fairly elevated level right now. The last time the highest we've ever seen this was a plus 85, and that was in Q2 of 2022, which if you recall, that last slide was sort of the height of our last inflation surge. So, and just so for those of you who are new to the webcast, this is a net rating system. We actually take the percentage of positive responses and subtract them from the negatives. And then so you could have 100, plus 100, or negative 100. In this case, a positive number is bad because of the way that question is worded. So firm leaders are definitely concerned about inflation. When we ask them about their concern regarding tariffs, that's actually much more subdued. Now, about 30% or so say, yes, I am concerned, but that's negated by another 20% or so who say, no, I'm not concerned. So the overall number is only a +9, but there's a bit of a disconnect. I think we've just sort of lost the maybe the headlines aren't there, and maybe it's just something that hasn't flowed through to people in our industry yet, and in terms of the firm finances, right? But inflation is definitely a big concern. And just the last one, and we'll move on to our next section, is mortgage rates obviously increasing. This makes housing less affordable. It's going to affect the housing and construction in that area as well. All right, so that's a bit about how the overall economy is doing. Now, let's turn our attention to the AE industry. And Thomas, talk us through this slide.
Right. So, we could basically see that represented visually growth in the industry has kind of been slowing. The most recent data for 2026 Q1 has total firm revenues at about 125 billion, and that represents a 1.9% year-over-year growth. This is kind of the second consecutive quarter of less than 2% year-over-year growth, and the last time that was happening in the industry was in Q1 2021, when we were basically coming out of the pandemic shock and even a few quarters of negative growth. So overall it is slowing, still growing, but growing at a much slower rate compared to 2022 through 2025. What though continues to grow is employment at our firms, which I do view as a good sign. And as we dive into some of the other sentiment data, this makes sense just due to the nature of the work and how our firms operate. You're kind of balancing work today versus what you think work in the future will be like. And that still seems to be somewhat robust. And then, if we take a look and really compare our industry to the economy as a whole, we continue, even despite hiring challenges, to have about, above 2% year-over-year growth, which, as you can see, has been very much diverging from the black line representing overall employment growth in the U.S., which has basically come to it stopped moving, for lack of a better term.
Right.
But we're still moving, at that 2%, which is kind of like a healthy, steady state level. We see how we were doing pre-COVID as well. And then, with respect to the overall construction industry, what we're seeing is that we kind of had peaked in about spring of 2025 in terms of total spending. And now we're, seeing basically declines. It's happening almost across the board. As you can see, the public sector is up a little bit, continuing to grow, but, the private construction side is about 70% of total construction spending, and that's declining. So, overall construction is declining for a variety of factors that we'll get into on some future slides. And, just with respect to residential versus non-residential, both are struggling. Residential more so. It seemed like it had kind of stabilized due to the increase in interest rates that happened in 2022. We see that kind of whipsaw where it went back down and started to come up a little bit, flattening out. But since the start of this year, it has actually declined more. As we saw on that other slide, we have the highest mortgage rates in over a year, so that's going to weigh down on that sector. Then non-residential down as well. We have other sectors dependent on cost of capital, as well as kind of changes in fiscal policy and programming and other items like that affecting it.
So, Thomas, this next slide I think is really interesting, and we're going to sort of talk about this with respect to the sector sentiment in a moment.
Mm-hmm. I think you might have frozen, but I will dive in on this slide. When we kind of get away from the overall aggregate data, we do see it's a little there's narrow growth, right? There are some sectors that are growing, like we call out in this top group, but are they growing that much? For something like religious or conservation and development, that growth is nowhere near the size of, let's say, manufacturing, which is declining a lot. But I kind of view the decline in manufacturing to be a function of almost a boom or bubble in manufacturing due to a variety of general changes of wanting to like reshore work, as well as industrial policy, the Science and Chips Act, the Inflation Reduction Act. And so that kind of, even though it's down 20% compared to a year ago, it's still, we've spent $87 billion on manufacturing year to date. That does put it now out of the top category. It is, just behind power, which is now the largest category for construction spending. And then you'll see office is now in the top 5, and that office category is really growing because data centers are a subsector of that. Then looking back at what's not growing, commercial, lodging, residential also not there, but is declining, and those are a big function of cost of capital, and then kind of different trends with respect to kind of like population, geography, things like that have affected core urban areas.
Yeah. All right. So I apologize. I had to turn off my camera because I think I'm experiencing some slow bandwidth here, but it's more important to hear me than to see me, although I'm sure we'll try to get that back on a little bit later. Okay, so we see how some of the data is showing what's showing us. So let's look again at the sentiment data that we are collecting. Two things to point out here, maybe three. One is there's a divergence between how firm leaders feel about the overall U.S. economy and how they feel about the engineering and design services industry, as well as their own firm finances. We have seen this for a long time, that there's this discrepancy and a divergence, sort of, it's unlinked. But we also, very interestingly, watch what's happening with sentiment regarding the U.S. economy, and it is literally up, down, up, down, up, down. And this is not normal. We've been doing this almost 6 years now, so this is not typical. But we're starting to see this trend, this line, just going downward. So even though we're having these ups and downs, generally speaking, we're in a heading in a lower direction, less optimism overall than perhaps where we were a year ago. But nonetheless, the industry, people are feeling good about the industry as well as about their own finances. And when we look at that condition of the U.S. economy, again, you can see, okay, up from the last quarter in all sectors, in all regions, firm size, etc. But then compared to a year ago, everything is trending downward. So I think there's a real consistency here. When we look at sentiment regarding the future of the U.S. economy, this will become even more stark. Now, here's where we see a lot of sort of similarities, Thomas, and what you're seeing in your economic data. This is sector-specific sentiment, and I circled in blue the highest of them. And the highest one is data centers at a plus 83. So clearly that has been booming. We see water and wastewater at plus 82. That has improved over the last year. And energy and utilities, which is very much tied to the data center boom. But there's other areas that are doing well in transportation, roads and bridges, as well as in airports and healthcare facilities. Even manufacturing, we're seeing very strong numbers there, and all of these are positive. We haven't seen a negative number quite some time. And when we did, it was in the residential and commercial area, but still, those are positive right now. When we look at backlogs, this is also really, really important. This shows us that, yep, our firms are feeling like where they've got work. This has been very steady. The median has been 11 to 12 months pretty consistently over the course of our survey. Early last year, dipped down to 10 months, but we're doing just fine. So this, I think, is what backs up the really good positive feelings that we have about the industry and the firm. And going back to your hiring data, we also see from sentiment data that 9 out of 10 firms have open positions. We don't have enough people in our industry to fill the position, and it's really difficult to find the new engineers that you need to do the work. And we continue to see a median number of open positions between 5 and 6, and you can see how that differs by region as well as by firm size. Again, extremely consistent when we look at that firm size number. One thing to note is a really big increase in the Northeast in terms of the median number of open positions in the last quarter. So there's particularly some strong demand in the Northeast right now. So what is the percentage of open positions here? So open positions as the percentage of overall FTEs is at 7%. We had been up at 9% for a long time, and then last year it ticked down to 8%, and now we're down to 7%. So on the margin, there's it's a little less tight than it was, but still 7% is quite high when you consider that we have about 1.5 million people working within our firms across the entire industry. So 7% is quite a large number. All right, well, Thomas, let's take a look at the future, see where we're heading. When it comes to that sentiment data, again, we're seeing the U.S. economy is trending negative, and it's been slowly declining here, but yet we see the opposite trend when it comes to the firms and the firm finances. So firms are feeling quite good. And this is where I think we have to pause for a second, Thomas, because we're seeing that overall industry revenues are moderating, right? That graph you showed earlier, we're under 2% year over year, but yet firms are saying, hey, we're feeling really, really good about our future and what's coming. I'm thinking there's a bit of an AI connection here. We know that firms are definitely utilizing AI, implementing AI in the back office when it comes to marketing and finance and HR, things in that area. And I think they're becoming much, much more productive in the back of the house. We're still not seeing a lot of widespread AI integration within the engineering side, but there's a lot of testing, a lot of piloting. What else, Thomas, could be behind this number that firms are feeling really, really good about their finances, but yet we've seen industry revenues level off?
I think some of it is kind of maybe firms and their, let's say, ethos or planning of like, you don't need to constantly grow at all costs. And so, if they have X number of employees and are doing, Y dollars in revenue today, and that is making you profitable, right? And profitable to a certain extent, then, we're not seeing declines, right, in the industry revenue. So that's not like, who says you have to then hire more people and grow your revenue 20%? Like, if you're able to do that. And I think, especially for smaller firms too, your books and math and how it all works. And you could just be a 10-person firm and stay a 10-person firm doing, X dollars of revenue and, continue to be well. So I think that nimbleness, and that can also be related to, kind of what you're getting at with respect to technology. Maybe 5 years ago, you thought you needed to hire 10 or 15 people for expanding functions, and now you realize you don't need to hire all those people while still, being able to deliver the amount of work you deliver. Then, that is okay.
Yeah, so really interesting. And I think we could dig more into that in some of the future studies, the future quarters. This is the breakdown when you look at the condition of the firm finances. Again, this is future looking. And because it's doing so well, I wanted to see, okay, how is it looking by region? And it's up in all regions year over year. Also by firm size, and year over year, it's up in all firm size categories as well. So looking very, very healthy in terms of our industry and the sentiment data we collect. This is future sector sentiment. Here we see science and technology at a plus 43. All of these, again, except one, are positive. One is there at a 0, so it's neutral. But most of our firm leaders are expecting that, yeah, we're going to see growth in all of these areas. I think the really interesting one to me, Thomas, is data centers, because we're seeing that really, really robust spending. It's the highest sector sentiment in our, when we're looking at current sentiment, but yet year over year, it's dropped, the future sentiment has dropped 26 points. And so that at first I was a little concerned, Thomas. I thought, well, are people expecting a slowdown in the data centers? But then I realized that's not the case. Do you want to talk about that for a minute?
Right. I mean, I think it kind of goes back to what we were talking about just with respect to overall industry revenue. Will data center growth, at least for, say, 2027, can it be higher? Yes. Is it going to be, this 40, 60, 80% higher? Most likely not, but it's just at such a high elevated level. And I also think there's a lot of things happening with data center project delivery that is kind of stretching out how long that money is flowing or being dispersed on the kind of upfront, let's say, policy side. We all know there are different moratoriums happening or pauses to data center growth, but also just on delivering projects. But this also ties into issues around inflation concerns. I was reading that GE and Siemens that make the giant gas turbines that are used for basically power facilities, they're sold out of those until 2031. So that means if you want some of these massive industrial pieces, you're waiting years and years just to get it, because they're only making a few a year and they've already been bought, right? And so that is going to then either extend or potentially impact development, where we basically, I think there's just a lot of supply and demand imbalances in different parts of the economy and the industry and the labor force. And so we're going to see that play out with data centers over the next 2 to 3 years as well.
Okay. Got another question from the audience that I think is much more directed towards you, Thomas. Are you seeing economic trends that signal modular home demand may grow in the U.S., given limited housing supply, mortgage rates hovering around 13-month highs, and individual debt increases? Any insight there?
I don't know about nationwide, but I have seen more reporting of, because I think a lot of that stuff comes down to local government and basically the allowances of these ADUs, which I think is alternative dwelling unit or something like that. But basically, if you own land or have land and there's a house on it, you can basically put another structure on it, and the modular homes are going to be the most cost-effective way to do that. I was reading some story where it was basically the cost of actually building a new home from scratch is just so astronomically high right now, where the economics of these prefab buildings really make sense. The key is obviously going to be that permitting piece, and that's just going to vary a lot jurisdiction to jurisdiction.
Okay. All right. Thanks for that information, Thomas. Let's continue on, and we'll keep answering your questions as we get them. So we have about half of the respondents now feel some negativity in one area or another, whether it's the US economy, whether it's the industry. And so we asked them why. And that number has been growing. If you look at the N, that's the number of people who are asked this, meaning that it's people who feel negative sentiment of any kind on that future sentiment slide. And that number is growing. We get about 600 replies to this survey every quarter, and we've gone up in terms of the number who has some negative sentiment. But the reasons for that negative sentiment have maintained their sort of relative positions, more or less. We see political environment and uncertainty, general economic uncertainty. Look at that again, starting last quarter and staying relatively stable there, a little down, but inflation and rising costs. That really does seem to be the number one thing on folks' mind that really is affecting the firms directly. Geopolitical conflicts, that's come down a little bit. And so we also see on this next slide, the other half, again, increasing interest rates, that jumped from 11% to 31 to 37%. So I think that really does seem to be the message this quarter is firms are much more concerned about the interest rate environment and what that impact that might have on their firm. Do you want to talk a little bit more about the supply chain and what's happening with the oil prices shock?
Right. I think we touched on it in that previous slide earlier, looking at the non-residential construction costs, but throughout, I don't see, costs improving for the rest of the year. And so these issues we're seeing now, which are kind of starting to hit the books or hit the data now with respect to these larger than expected cost increases, this will continue to be a problem throughout the rest of 2026.
Yeah. Okay. And thank you for the comment, Aaron. ADU is accessory dwelling unit. All right. So now that is something I learned as well. So thank you. All right. Looking at sentiment regarding future backlog, that is also very healthy, and it's sort of been on an upward trend here over the last year. So that's good news from the firms. When we look at hiring sentiment going forward, we also see very strong positive sentiment, a plus at 59. That's basically saying about 70% or more people feel like they're going to continue hiring in the next year, and pretty consistent increases across most firm sizes. Although that mid-sized firm, it's staying relatively steady there, but still very, very strong numbers. Recession concerns, we continue to see those fall. Well, I shouldn't say continue. They go up and down, up and down. We saw it fall over the last quarter. This tracks very, very much in line with the overall sentiment regarding the U.S. economy. But fortunately, we were at above 50% early last year, but we've been in the 40s now. So there's definitely some concern out there, but not as much as there could be. All right, well, that leaves us for the hot topics, and we always have a hot topics section every quarter. This time we are looking at licensure. This is really part of a preview to what we're going to be embarking on in September. We're starting a brand new study that's going to look at why young engineers opt to pursue licensure, why they opt not to pursue licensure, what can firms do to support their employees in being licensed. So it's all about licensure. So we've got a few numbers to share with you all today. And again, please feel free to put in some more questions. I know we're going to have a few minutes for questions today. But when we look at this metric here, 93% of firm leaders say it's important that entry-level engineers pass the FE exam. So that's a pretty stark number there. It's clear that firm leaders say, yes, this is something that is at least somewhat important, and 2/3 of firm leaders say it's important or very important. So definitely licensure is seen as important by firm leaders. And nearly all firms indicate that a PE license is required for at least some positions. 96% of firms said yes to that. And then we asked the follow-up question, what positions typically require a PE license within your firm. And here's what you see: we threw all the answers into chat, and it came out with the information for us. And you can read this in more detail at your leisure. But this all makes sense, right? Especially if you have responsible charge, if you have to be the person that's sealing and putting the stamp on those drawings, etc. But basically, it's higher level positions within a firm. And so it's very clear from our research that if you want to advance in the profession, you're going to need to get your PE license. Having said that, what we found when we asked what percentage of engineers employed at your firm have their PE license, the median and mean are right about the same at 45, 46%. So not even half of all engineers have their PE license. I think there's more to dig into here, but some of the other research that I've conducted pretty much supports the number that we came out with. We didn't see much variance here when we looked at firm size. So you really can say that a typical firm has about half of their engineers with their license. I do think demographics plays at some of this because we know there are a lot of people retiring and there's a lot of new young engineers. So, obviously it takes time and you have to get your experience before you can get your PE license. So that's certainly there. But again, this really underscores the need for our conducting the research that we're about to embark upon. Why is there somewhat a sense of a disconnect in terms of importance of having your license, and yet only half of engineers currently have their license? And we also asked the final question: the vast majority of firms do strongly encourage their engineers to obtain a PE license. That other percent, 9%, at least half of those, so 5% or so of the where we require it. It's not just encourage, we require it. So that's the hot topic data that we have today, and we still have time for questions. So please submit your questions. We're very happy to answer them. And we'll show you the QR code that you can download the full report. There's a lot more information in the full report from the sentiment data. So we'll show that in a few minutes once we get through any questions. While we're waiting on questions, Thomas, is there anything else that you wanted to add regarding the data that we've talked about today?
I think again, one thing to the point about the economic sentiment and folks' opinion on the economy and how much that is like seesawing, but their firm finances are staying the same. What we're seeing in a lot of data, comparing sentiment data from other surveys, right? Like not ACEC's, and the actual data is there is a much bigger post COVID disconnect between what the data is in terms of jobs, GDP, income, all of that, and what sentiment is. So it does seem like almost overall people are frankly more negative on the economy from a sentiment standpoint these past few years compared to how it's actually performing. I would guess that inflation piece is having a very, almost like outsized effect on how people are perceiving things. But, I thought that was pretty interesting because then it makes it pretty tough to go from, survey sentiment, opinions and teasing out what's going to then happen with the actual quantitative performance.
Yeah. So we've got some questions coming in now. I'm going to take the one most recently first, since you're talking about inflation. With the inflation trends, can you give any thoughts on anticipated Fed moves or interest rates over the next few quarters? Let's see. That's $1 million question right there. Thomas, what do you think? I've got some thoughts on that as well. You're the economist.
Well, I think we're in a tough place where the reason they would lower rates is that then the economy is in the economy needs to get into a worse position, for lack of a better term, which would probably mean unemployment's going to increase a lot, which though then means we lower rates, which then is going to continue to spur inflation potentially. The alternative is I don't think we're at a point where I feel like if we were to raise rates to try to curb the inflation, because things are still very delicate in other sectors, look at how, like, I mean, the commercial and residential markets, that almost would be like too much of a burden on those markets. And so we might just kind of be stuck in a place where we're gonna, have to stay still with rates and just kind of deal with this stagflation environment. Big thing will be what the Fed Reserve Chair communicates tomorrow at their event, to kind of get an idea of what data, they are following to try to make their decisions off of. All that being said, we've all been looking at the same data the past 4+ years, which has been showing inflation, whether it's CPI or PCE or what have you, has been well above the 2% target, and nothing has been done to try to get it back to that. So maybe 2% is not really going to be the target that they determine is what we can kind of stand as an economy.
Yeah, so I think you did a much better job than I could, Thomas, of explaining the lay of the land there. My 2 cents on it as a sort of the armchair economist is that, I think my concern always is inflation. I'm always worried about that because of the cost to consumers. And so I would be more in favor of some limited rate hikes. But I also think there's the other side of the equation in that we have effectively stopped migration in this country, and the population is not growing. Therefore, the population is going to age, and we're going to see fewer younger workers and more people who are retired. There's a reason historically that we have grown, and it's even in the more recent decades, we're not producing enough people, meaning babies. We're not having enough babies. People who have been born in the U.S. are not replacing themselves, and so the nation has grown through migration. The economy has grown through migration. And so I'm making an economic case that we need to actually allow for more migration to have a healthy economy. So I think there's 2 sides of the coin that I see. We got a couple other questions here. Do you see any insights, or do we have any insights on AI trends and the desire or need for young people to get licensed? That's a really, really interesting question. I'm not sure we have any data yet to support that, but I do think that's going to be a focus, at least one of the focal points of our upcoming research. We need to find out what is it that is inhibiting the younger folks from wanting to get their license, and what will help prompt them to do so. I think certainly there could be some issues there, but I don't know. I don't have any data to back that up yet. Another question here. This is so from Ben. Thank you, Ben. This is my first ACEC webinar. I'm curious about the historic rates of PE licenses. Does the median data shared today generally reflect past rates, etc.? So that's a really great question, Ben, and we don't have the data to answer that. So that's another reason why we're going to start tracking this. We're going to start, at least now, we'll have data that we can look back on. But there's not a good source for that information right now. And we don't really know quantitatively from the data I've seen what's happened over the last 10 years. But as we dive into this study, we're going to figure that out. All right, one more question here. Do we have data available showing how much of the workforce, specifically at PE firms, is native versus foreign born? Specifically, when it comes to speaking with our legislative members, important to speak how we are not like tech, and we need to focus, and we need folks to come in. Yeah, so that I don't have any stats on that. And Thomas, I'll ask you in a moment, but what I can say is from the workforce study that I conducted last year, we know that there are tens of thousands of individuals, they're foreign-born individuals who come to study in the United States and graduate with an engineering degree, and tens of thousands of those individuals are not then granted a license to work here, and they must return to their country. So there's definitely some evidence there that we're educating, the workforce that we need, but we're not allowing those engineers with degrees to stay. Very small percentage are granted a H-1B visa because H-1B visas are limited. So I don't know if you have any other comments on that, Thomas.
I mean, I know that, there's limited mechanisms for, I guess, like working in the US, and, basically things like the H-1B visa, which have a cap at a number, it might be around 200,000. I don't know the answer right off the top of my head. It changes. But unfortunately, there's a limited basically amount of slots, right? And they seem to get gobbled up by kind of by non-engineering firms, let's put it that way. So it's pretty hard.
Yeah, and that's absolutely true. I forget the exact number. I don't have it in front of me, but there's a handful of companies like Amazon, Google, etc., that there's probably no more than 10, and they get at least 10% of those H-1B visas for their workers. So, all right, I think we have time for one more question before we have to close this out. In the medical field, they're steadily shifting more procedures to non-MDs, and nurse practitioners and physician assistants. This has been driven by the states against the AMA voice. Is this a precursor to what could happen with PEs in the engineering field? I mean, that's a good question. Thomas, I'm not sure I have a good answer to that one yet. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, if some of it is basically a non-PE doing PE work, but then at the end, the PE reviews and stamps it, I think, in some respects that might already be happening or something like that. I don't then know, I think with, at least on the, probably not exactly like the medical work, because you can go see a nurse practitioner. They can, I don't know, diagnose you because you have a cold and write you a prescription for amoxicillin and all that. Would non-PEs be able to do the, say, like the whole like duty of care requirements? I don't think that would happen, but also that is definitely a question for, I think, our lobbying team, who understands the nuances of licensure much better than me.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. And thank you, Thomas. Glad to have you back. Just want to say a big thank you to all of the firms who support the work that we do here at the ACEC Research Institute. Thank you so much. If your name is on here, we really appreciate your firm name is on here. Thank you so much for your generous support. If your firm isn't on here, please contact Daphne Bryant at the ACEC Research Institute to see how you could support the work we do. And also, as promised, here is that QR code. You can use this to get access to the report. You can also just go to the ACEC Research Institute website. You can download the report there as well. And all the research we do is available free to everyone in the industry. So again, thank you for the support from our sponsors. And thank you for joining our webinar today. That's it. We're going to wrap it up. And again, have a good rest of your day.